The room was not special in any way. It was a medium-sized hall used for small programs, rehearsals, and occasional community events. The lights were soft but a little uneven, some brighter than others. Chairs were placed without much thought, and people sat wherever they found space. Conversations floated through the air, quiet laughs, casual comments, the sound of phones being put away. No one expected anything memorable to happen that evening. She sat near the back at first, not drawing attention to herself. Her posture was relaxed but careful, as if she didn't want to take up more space than necessary. She wore simple clothes, nothing flashy or eye-catching. If someone looked at her, they might assume she was just another guest, someone who had come to watch and then quietly leave. Most people did not look twice. The piano stood at the front of the room. It wasn't new or polished. A few keys showed signs of wear, and the surface had small scratches that told stories of years of use. It was the kind of piano people noticed only because it was there, not because they expected magic from it. Earlier performers had played light background music on it, pleasant, safe, forgettable tunes. As the program moved along, the mood stayed casual. A few short performances came and went. People clapped politely, sometimes checking the time or whispering to the person beside them. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt important. At one point, someone near the front glanced around and noticed her. They had heard, maybe through a passing comment or a quiet suggestion, that she could play the piano. It wasn't said with excitement. It was more like a side note, an afterthought. "Why don't you play something?" The person said, smiling lightly. "Just something simple." The words were not meant to be unkind, but they carried a certain weight. Something simple. A small tune. A short melody to fill the silence before the event moved on. No pressure, no expectations. A few people turned to look at her. Their expressions were neutral. Curious maybe, but not impressed. Some leaned back in their chairs, ready for a quick performance that would pass the time. She hesitated for a moment. Not because she was nervous, but because she understood the moment. She had lived moments like this before. Being asked casually, being underestimated without anyone realizing they were doing it. She nodded once and stood up. As she walked toward the piano. The room didn't change. Conversations didn't stop right away. Someone adjusted their seat. Another person coughed softly. No one leaned forward yet. No one held their breath. She sat on the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. Her movements were calm and practiced, but not dramatic. She placed her hands in her lap for a brief second and looked at the keys. Her face showed focus, but also something deeper and inward, quiet, as if she had stepped into a familiar inner space. Still, no one expected much. To them, she was just someone fulfilling a request. Someone playing a simple tune. What they didn't know was how long this moment had been building. She had grown up around music, but not in a way people found impressive. There were no grand stages or fancy introductions. Her connection to the piano started quietly, almost by accident. The instrument had been there during times when words failed her. When life felt heavy, the piano listened without judging. When days felt empty, it gave them shape. She learned early on that music did not need permission. She practiced when no one was watching. Late evenings, early mornings, stolen moments between responsibilities. There were days when she doubted herself, days when her hands felt tired and her heart even more so. But she kept playing, not because she wanted praise, because she needed it, but none of that was visible now. To the people in the room, she was still just a quiet figure at an old piano. Someone whispered, "She's probably nervous." Another smiled politely. Ready to clap, no matter how it sounded? She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. The room was still not fully quiet, but something subtle shifted. Not because of sound yet, but because of her presence. There was a steadiness in the way she sat, a sense of purpose that didn't demand attention but slowly pulled it in. Before playing, she paused. Just a second longer than expected. It was not hesitation, it was respect. Respect for the instrument, for the moment, and for herself. In that pause, the room slowly settled. Conversations faded. Phones stayed in pockets. People looked up. They were still expecting something simple, a short tune, a few notes. Something nice that no one knew that this simple request had opened a door. She rarely walked through in front of others. For years, she had kept her deeper playing private. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. She knew that not every space was ready. Not every audience listened with their heart. And she had learned to protect what mattered to her, but tonight felt different. Not because the room was special, but because the request, small as it was, gave her permission. Permission to sit. Permission to play. Permission to speak in the only language that had always told the truth for her. She took a slow breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Steady and sure, even now, people did not expect what was coming. They still thought they were about to hear something simple, and she was about to remind them, without saying a word, that simple does not always mean small, that sometimes the quietest people carry the deepest stories. And sometimes, when you ask for a simple tune, you unknowingly invite something much bigger. Her fingers lowered, and the very first note was about to touch the room. Long before she ever sat at that piano in front of others, music had already shaped her life in quiet ways. It wasn't something she talked about often, and it wasn't something people around her fully noticed. To the outside world, she lived a normal life with normal responsibilities and normal struggles. But behind that calm surface was a story built note by note, year by year. Her first real connection with the piano came during a time when her world felt unstable. Life around her was noisy, demanding, and sometimes overwhelming. There were days when she felt unseen and unheard, even by people close to her. Words often failed her. When she tried to explain how she felt, they came out wrong or not at all. But the piano never misunderstood her. The instrument itself was old, much older than she was. Some keys were heavier than others, and a few made sounds that weren't perfectly clean. Still, it became her safe place. When she pressed the keys, it felt like the piano was listening. It didn't rush her. It didn't judge her mistakes. It simply responded. She didn't start learning music in a formal way. There were no expensive lessons or structured schedules in the beginning. She learned by watching, listening, and trying again and again. Sometimes she copied melodies she heard. Other times, she made up her own, letting her fingers wander until something felt right. It was slow, and it was not easy, but it was honest. As she grew older, responsibilities grew with her. Life didn't pause so she could practice. There were long days filled with work, family duties, and expectations. Many evenings she was tired before she even touched the piano. Her fingers ached. Her back hurt. Some nights she wondered if all the effort was worth it. But she kept going. Not because someone told her she was talented. Not because anyone praised her. In fact, very few people knew how much time she spent practicing. The piano was something she did for herself. It was the one place where she didn't have to explain who she was or what she felt. There were moments when doubt crept in. She would hear others play and think they were better, more confident, more deserving of attention. She questioned whether her music mattered at all. On those days, she would stop playing halfway through a piece, resting her hands on the keys, staring into space. Yet, even then, she always came back. Music became her way of processing life. When she felt sad, the notes softened. When she felt angry, the sound grew stronger and sharper. When she felt hopeful, the melody lifted. Every emotion found its place on the keyboard. Over time, she learned not just how to play notes, but how to tell stories through them. Still, she rarely played for others. Part of it was fear, but not the kind people usually imagine. She wasn't afraid of making mistakes. She was afraid of being misunderstood. Music to her was personal. Letting others hear it felt like opening a private diary. She worried that people would only hear sounds, not meaning. So she stayed quiet. At gatherings, she listened instead of speaking. When people talked about hobbies or talents, she smiled and changed the subject. If there was a piano nearby, she avoided it unless asked directly. And even then, she usually played something short and light, just enough to meet expectations. Over time, people placed her into a simple category, quiet, polite, ordinary, and she let them. What they didn't see were the nights she stayed up practicing after everyone else slept. The times she played the same section over and over until her fingers memorized it. The moments she cried while playing, not because she was sad, but because the music finally said what she couldn't. There were sacrifices too. She gave up free time, comfort, and sometimes sleep. She chose the piano over rest, over distractions, over easier paths. Not once did she think of it as a burden. It was a choice she made again and again. Music helped her survive periods when life felt heavy, when things didn't go as planned, when doors closed without explanation. The piano didn't fix her problems, but it gave her strength to face them. It reminded her that even in chaos, harmony could exist. As years passed, her playing changed. It became deeper, more intentional. She no longer rushed through pieces. She learned the value of silence between notes. She understood that sometimes what you don't play is just as important as what you do. But she still stayed in the background. Opportunities came and went. Small chances to step forward, to be noticed. Each time she hesitated. Not because she didn't believe in her ability, but because she wasn't sure the world was ready to listen. And maybe she wasn't ready to be seen. So when she was asked that night to play something simple, it touched something old inside her. That familiar feeling of being underestimated. That quiet assumption that she could offer only a small moment of entertainment. She had felt it many times before. But this time, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She was calm. Calm in a way that comes only after years of holding back. After years of learning, growing, and waiting, she realized she no longer needed permission to be herself. She didn't need approval to play honestly. The piano had already given her everything she needed. As she sat there, hands near the keys, all those years came together. The struggles, the practice, the quiet nights, the doubt and the determination. None of it was visible on her face, but it lived in her hands. To the people watching, she was still just someone about to play a tune. To her, this was a moment of truth. Not a performance for applause, but an expression of everything she had carried silently for so long. The music she was about to play wasn't chosen to impress. It wasn't chosen to prove anything. It was chosen because it was real, because it held pieces of her life, shaped by time and experience. She didn't know how the room would react. But for the first time, she didn't care. All she knew was that when her fingers touched the keys, they would speak honestly. And whatever happened after that would no longer be in her control. The piano had waited patiently for her voice, and now she was finally ready to let it be heard. She took a slow breath, placing her fingers on the keys, feeling their worn edges beneath her touch. The piano was not new, but to her that didn't matter. Every scratch and mark on it told a story, a reminder that it had survived years of hands and hearts, just as she had. And now it was ready to listen to her story too. The first note she played was soft, almost hesitant. But even that small sound carried something unusual, a depth that made people pause without realizing why. It wasn't flashy. It didn't demand attention. It was honest, simple, and yet somehow it made the room shift. Conversations stopped. People straightened in their seats. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, she continued, slowly building the melody. The tune started to grow, each note connected to the next like a gentle conversation. Her hands moved naturally over the keys, her fingers pressing the notes with care and precision. There was a quiet rhythm to it, one that seemed to echo the steady heartbeat of life itself. The sound filled the room gradually, not loudly, but in a way that made the space feel warmer, more intimate. No one expected this. They thought it would be a small, forgettable tune, a few notes to pass the time. But the music was different. It wasn't just notes on a page. Each chord, each pause, seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a part of her life. People in the room could feel it without even knowing why. It wasn't just sound. It was a story being told without words. As she played, she remembered the countless nights she had spent alone at this instrument. The nights when her hands were tired, her back ached, and her eyes were heavy with fatigue. The nights when she had cried silently, letting the piano absorb her fears and frustrations. All those hours of practice, the endless repetitions, the mistakes corrected in silence, they were all coming together now. In a single, unbroken thread of music, the tune began to change. It became more complex, not in a way that showed off skill, but in a way that revealed emotion. Some notes were soft and lingering, almost hesitant, as if questioning what was to come. Others were strong and certain, full of resolve, like someone who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. The melody moved up and down, twisting gently like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes rushing. People started leaning forward without realizing it. Eyes widened slightly, mouths closing in silent attention. Some listeners were moved, almost imperceptibly at first, while others were visibly stunned. They had expected something simple, something safe. But what was unfolding before them was far from ordinary. It was alive, breathing, and full of meaning. Her hands glided over the keys, fingers moving as if they had a life of their own. She didn't rush. She didn't pause unnecessarily. Every note was measured, deliberate, chosen. Every chord was a reflection of a thought, a feeling, a moment from her past. It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. It was about letting the music tell what words could not. She remembered the first time she realized that music could be more than sound. It was a memory from her childhood. She had been sitting alone in a small room, a rainy day outside, the house quiet except for the soft tapping of raindrops. She had played a few simple notes on the piano, just something she had learned earlier. And then, without knowing how, she began to feel something change inside her. The notes seemed to reach into her, giving shape to feelings she didn't have words for. It was at that moment she understood. Music could speak what words could not. Now, as she played in front of an audience, that memory returned. But it was different this time. She wasn't alone. She wasn't playing just for herself. And yet she felt no pressure, no need to perform or impress. She only needed to be true. She only needed to let the music flow. The melody grew more expressive. There were moments of tension where a minor chord would linger a beat too long, creating a sense of longing or uncertainty. Then, almost as if resolving a question, a brighter note would follow, lifting the mood, bringing a sense of release. Her fingers danced over the keys with confidence, moving naturally between softness and strength, speed and calm. The room was silent now, completely absorbed. Even those who had been whispering before were now holding their breath. A few people unconsciously leaned closer, their faces showing curiosity, awe, and an unspoken connection to the music. Some eyes glistened. Some hands clenched softly, holding on to emotions they didn't yet understand. She could feel the room's attention, but she didn't let it distract her. She was present entirely in the moment, connected to every note, every sound. She was telling her story, but she was also listening to it. Music had become a conversation between her heart and the piano. Each note was a word. Each pause was a thought. And the room strangers in seats was listening without judgment. She began to think of all the people who had underestimated her over the years. Those who assumed her quiet nature meant she was ordinary. Those who thought her talents were small. She felt no resentment toward them. Instead, she felt a calm satisfaction. The music itself would say what she never had to. She didn't need to explain. She didn't need to argue. Every chord she played carried that truth. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled. The melody twisted and turned, sometimes delicate, sometimes intense. It told a story of persistence, of quiet struggle, of determination to keep moving forward even when life seemed unfair. Each note was a reminder that talent, patience, and passion are often invisible to the world. Until given a chance to shine. There were parts where she almost forgot the people in the room entirely. She was lost in the music, in the memories it brought back, in the emotions it carried. A sudden laugh from her childhood, a tear from a difficult year. The quiet pride of mastering something that once seemed impossible. All of it poured into her performance without effort. And then came the quiet moments. The pauses between phrases where the music softened, barely audible, almost like a whisper. Those moments made the louder sections even more powerful. It was in those silences that the listeners felt the weight of her story. Not just the notes, but what the notes didn't say, what was left to be felt, what was left to be imagined. People were holding their breath, leaning in. They had expected simple. They were hearing extraordinary. Each note seemed to reach directly into their hearts, creating an unexpected connection. The room, once casual and distracted, had transformed into a shared space of quiet emotion. She played a final section that was slow and gentle. It wasn't dramatic or showy. It was soft, reflective, almost like a conversation that was coming to its natural end. Every note seemed to linger in the air, giving listeners time to absorb it, to feel it, to understand it in their own way. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, there was a pause. Not a long one, but a pause heavy with emotion. The room was silent for a moment, as if no one quite knew how to respond. Then gradually applause began. First a few soft claps, then louder, more people joining in, some rising to their feet. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't expected. It was genuine. She stood slowly, taking a quiet bow. Her face was calm, almost neutral, but inside there was a deep sense of satisfaction. She had not played to impress anyone. She had not played to show off. She had played to speak the truth she had carried for years. And for the first time in a public space, that truth had been heard. People came forward afterward, expressing surprise, admiration, and gratitude. They wanted to know how she learned to play like that, how she created something so moving out of a simple request. But she smiled and stayed humble. She knew that what they heard was more than skill. It was years of quiet practice, resilience, and honesty. It was her life distilled into sound, and as the room buzzed with conversation, she quietly walked back to her seat. She felt calm. She felt proud, but not boastful. She felt connected to the audience in a way that words could never describe. Music had spoken for her, and it had done so beautifully that night. The lesson was clear, not just for those who listened, but for her as well. Sometimes the world underestimates quiet people. Sometimes a small request can reveal something extraordinary. And sometimes the deepest stories are told without a single word. She would leave the room the same way she had entered, calm, unassuming, almost invisible to anyone who didn't look closely. But now, the people who had witnessed her playing would remember. They would remember the honesty, the depth, and the quiet power of someone who had finally let their voice be heard, and she would remember too. She would remember that moment when a simple tune became a masterpiece, not because of anyone else's expectations, but because she finally trusted herself to speak through the music she had loved all her life. When the final note faded, the room didn't immediately erupt in applause. There was a moment of stillness, almost as if the air itself was catching its breath. People were not sure whether to speak, to clap, or simply to sit in silence. That brief pause carried more weight than any fanfare could. It was as if everyone present realized they had witnessed something rare, a moment that could not be repeated or explained easily. She remained at the piano for a few seconds longer, not because she had to, but because she wanted to honor the moment. Her fingers hovered above the keys, remembering the journey that had led to this very instant. She could feel the collective attention of the room, the unspoken acknowledgement that what she had shared was more than music, it was life itself. Then the applause began. At first, it was tentative, soft, almost shy. Some people clapped with their hands close to their bodies, unsure how loud was appropriate. Others clapped with more confidence, their appreciation spilling over as they realized the music had moved them. Slowly, the sound grew, filling the room with warmth and recognition. A few people even rose to their feet, unable to contain the emotion they felt. It wasn't polite or obligatory. It was genuine, heartfelt. She lowered her hands, feeling a mix of relief and quiet pride. She had not played to impress, but still, the response was overwhelming. For a moment, she allowed herself to notice the faces in the audience, the wide eyes, the smiles, the tears glistening in the corners of a few eyes. Each reaction was different, but they all carried the same truth. The music had reached them. Afterwards, people approached her one by one, each with their own words of admiration. Some tried to mask their amazement. saying things like, "That was beautiful," or "You played very well." But in their eyes, she could see something deeper, a recognition that she had shared something personal, something meaningful, something that went beyond notes and rhythm. One person admitted quietly, "I didn't expect that. I thought it would be simple, but it wasn't. It was incredible." Others nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with awe. And she smiled softly, humbly. She didn't need to say much. The music had spoken, and that was enough. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some lingering to talk about the performance, she realized that the experience had changed something inside her as well. She had always played in private, letting her fingers speak what her words could not. But now she had shared that truth openly. And in doing so, she had discovered something unexpected, that vulnerability could be powerful, that honesty could create connection, that trust in oneself could inspire trust in others. She remembered the years of solitude and practice, the countless nights she spent perfecting pieces while the world moved on without noticing. Those hours had felt endless and sometimes lonely, but they had prepared her for this moment. She realized that every challenge she had faced, every moment of self-doubt, had led her to the point where she could sit confidently at the piano and let her soul speak. As she packed her things quietly, she noticed small gestures from the audience, people lingering at the door, exchanging looks, smiling knowingly. It was clear that they had felt something, even if they couldn't put it into words. Music had a way of doing that. It could communicate across barriers, reaching hearts directly. She had felt that power now, and it was humbling. Walking out of the hall, she didn't feel any need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify why she had played the way she did, or why she had poured so much of herself into a simple tune. Those who had been present understood in their own way. The applause, the silence, the eyes that had followed her every move, they were all confirmation enough. Later, as she reflected on the evening, she realized that the impact of the performance would last longer than the notes themselves. People might forget the exact melody, but they wouldn't forget the feeling it created, the calm, the emotion, the honesty. Music had a way of leaving impressions that words often failed to capture. It had a memory that lingered, like a whisper that stayed with you long after the room was empty. She thought about the casual request that had started it all. "Just something simple," they had said. At first she had almost laughed to herself. Simple? What was simple for someone who had lived through years of practice, struggle, and quiet devotion? And yet that request had given her the freedom to create something larger than expected, to reveal a side of herself that few had seen. It was a reminder that small moments could carry great significance, that sometimes opportunities appeared in forms that seemed ordinary or insignificant, but were in fact gateways to something extraordinary. That night, the request had been ordinary, but the result was unforgettable. She also realized that her own perception of herself had shifted. For years, she had seen her talent as private, something meant only for her own growth and solace. She had feared exposure, feared that the world might misunderstand or undervalue her efforts. But the audience's reaction had shown her that vulnerability could be met with appreciation, that authenticity could inspire connection. She felt a newfound confidence, not arrogant, but quiet and steady, like a light that had always been there but was now allowed to shine. As she walked home, the cool evening air brushing against her face, she thought about the journey that had led to this point. The early mornings, the late nights, the frustration of mistakes, the quiet victories. Each step had been necessary. Each struggle had contributed to her ability to speak through music, to touch others without words, and to convey the depth of her experiences. And she understood something else. That music was not just about skill. It was about courage. Courage to show what you truly feel, courage to face an audience with honesty, courage to transform personal experience into something shared and understood. That courage had always been there, quietly waiting for the right moment. That night it had finally been called forth. She knew this wouldn't be the end. There would be other opportunities, other audiences, other moments where her talent could be shared. But she also knew that the significance of this particular evening would stay with her forever. It was a turning point, a reminder that her dedication, patience, and honesty had value beyond private satisfaction. It had meaning for others too. As she prepared to leave the hall entirely, she noticed the lingering smiles, the few people who stayed back to watch her leave, and the quiet hum of conversation about the music they had just heard. She felt a sense of gratitude not only for her own ability to play, but for the audience's willingness to listen, to be present, and to receive what she had offered. She walked down the street, her steps light, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced before. The world outside the hall seemed the same buildings, the same streets, the same passing strangers, but to her it felt subtly different. There was a quiet confidence now, a gentle assurance that what she had inside her could reach others if she allowed it. She remembered the nights of doubt, the moments when she wondered if anyone would ever understand, the times when she felt small and unseen. All of that had led to this moment. And now she realized that her past, her struggles, and her quiet persistence had created something remarkable. She had turned personal dedication into shared beauty. By the time she reached her home, the echoes of the performance were still alive in her mind. Not as a memory of applause or admiration, but as a sense of fulfillment. She had been true to herself, and the world had responded in kind. The piano, which had been her companion for so many solitary years, had carried her voice to others, and that voice had been heard deeply and sincerely. As she lay down that night, she thought about the people who had listened, the ones who had felt the music in their own way. Some might have been moved to tears, others to reflection, and some simply to quiet appreciation. It didn't matter how each person reacted, only that the music had created a connection, a shared human moment that transcended words. She closed her eyes, feeling the satisfaction of having embraced her gift fully, without reservation or hesitation. She understood that the power of music lay not in its complexity, but in its authenticity, in the courage to express truth, in the willingness to share what is often hidden, and in the quiet assurance that when one plays from the heart, others will hear, even if they cannot explain why. That night, she slept with a sense of calm and accomplishment. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she had crossed an important milestone. She had shown herself and the world that a simple request could be transformed into something extraordinary. That quiet persistence, dedication, and honesty could leave a mark far beyond expectation, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen, not through words or praise, but through the universal language of music, a language that speaks directly to the heart and leaves a lasting impression on the soul.